For those of you who don't know me, my name's Dylan Casey, and I'm a product manager here. And before coming to Google, I was a professional cyclist with the U.S. Postal Service cycling team, and had a lot of great experiences there, and learned a lot of very valuable lessons, and have been successful at applying a lot of the things that I learned there here at Google. So on that note, it's my pleasure and it's my honor to introduce Johan Bruyneel, who is my sport director and former boss and very close friend. And I'm excited to have him here tonight, and thanks to the wonderful authors group for putting this whole thing together. Johan will talk for a little bit, and then we wanted to save most of the time for Q&A. So get your questions queued up, and we'll kick it off.
First, I would like to say thank you to Google for hosting this event. I was lucky enough to have a little tour of the facility, and I have to say I'm really impressed with what you guys have going on here. Me as a European, it's difficult to imagine what it's like, and definitely got a few good ideas. I saw massage rooms and swimming pools and a gym and free food and stuff like that. So I want to say thank you to Dylan also to set this up. And normally I would talk a little bit about my book, but I see that a few of you have it already. And I guess there's quite a few cycling fans in the room. Is that right? So rather than me telling you what's in there, I would encourage everybody to ask me questions, and the more the better. And you can ask me about anything. You can ask me about I don't know if somebody has been reading the book already, or if you have questions about cycling, or about American cycling, or about why I'm not in France for the moment. So I would suggest that we do this for half an hour to 45 minutes, and if everybody has one question, I think we'll get longer than that. So again, thanks for it's a big honor for me to be here at this great company. And who has the first question? Yes. Can you go to the mic?
Okay. My question is about doping. I'll just dig into a first question there.
Great first question.
So I guess I'll leave it wide open to you, but there's a view it's widespread, and it's kind of sad for the sport, or any sport. So if you could elaborate on that would be great.
What do you want to know specifically?
Okay, specifically, do you feel it's so widespread?
In cycling?
Yes.
Yeah. Cycling is, in my opinion, and it's not because I did it myself or because I'm still involved. In my opinion, it's the hardest sport in the world. That's number one. Number two, I think that as any professional sport, there's more and more a lot of money involved and a lot of fame involved. And so I think it's logical that if those things are there, it's very hard physically, and you can get a lot of money and you can get famous. There's certain people who are going to cheat. I think that's the same thing in any part of life, not only in sports. But it's true that cycling has a bad reputation in relation to doping, and I think it has a few reasons. There's a few reasons for that, and I think first of all it's because the testing. I think there's no other sport in the world that has done so much against doping, because there were some problems in the past, and they were in the media. But I think if you look at the problem now, I think it's basically a problem of perception, because there's so many tests in cycling compared to any other sport. In terms of quantity, first of all, and also in terms of quality. There's specific tests which are in cycling, only in cycling, and not in any other sport. So I would want to compare it a little bit with if you're riding on a highway and there's speed controls every 50 miles or every 5 miles. You're gonna get more tickets. So obviously, there's been a lot of positive cases, and it's definitely not been good. But as I say, it's definitely not the real picture. I think that other sports have more or less the same problem. So now I don't want to defend, of course, the use of doping in sports, and cycling I think has reacted in a very good way the last year and a half, I would say, when really the drug scandals were having a very negative impact on the sport, and sponsors went away, and new companies didn't come in. And at the end of the day, the athletes, they see that their job is in danger. And just to give you an example, at the beginning of this year, there was, of all the elite teams, there were 5 big teams who didn't have a sponsor for next year. So if you calculate and you're a bit smart, you don't have to be really smart to say 5 times 30 is 150. That's 150 jobs less if those teams don't renew. And I think that this year specifically we have seen a big change. Until now, there's and I touch wood. We didn't see a big scandal in the sport, and I think that everybody has really started to realize that the sport was in danger. It was not only the rider who had the opportunity to take a shortcut, but the sport was really in danger. And once everybody really has realized that this was such a bad situation that maybe next year there's a lot of jobs less, it was definitely the group, the sport, the peloton reacted in a good way, and I think you can see it in the races. There's a different atmosphere. Doesn't mean that the speeds have gone down or anything like that, but there's a different atmosphere, and I think the media has reacted very positively to it, and especially one of the very good signs is that we saw that this year finally new companies came into the sport again, and the last 2 years it didn't happen. And just to give 2 examples here in the United States, High Road and Slipstream both found a new sponsor, and I know how difficult it was last year. We were with Discovery, and Discovery had announced that they would finish their sponsorship, and we didn't find a sponsor, and we had our best season ever. So I think it's definitely going the good direction, and I just hope it continues to be like that. I guess it's the first one who runs to the microphone who gets the question. Yeah.
So I was just wondering if you could talk about the impact of not being in the Tour on Astana's plans for this year. Like, would you have done the Giro? I mean, how did you change things? Did you think, the other question is, did you think the ASO would back down? And at any rate, just about all of that, how you went about that.
Yeah, well, it was a difficult situation from the beginning, but it was also something that we really had calculated a little bit into our plans. Definitely about the Tour, because the Tour had already given some small indications that there would be a risk that we would not be at the Tour. And I thought that, with the defending champion of last year, we would be in, but we are not. Something I didn't count on, of course, was the Tour of Italy. They decided at first that we were not invited, and that was definitely a big disappointment, which changed our whole plan. But still, we focused on all the races that we were allowed to do, and we started very strongly with winning the Tour of California and winning the Tour of the Basque Country and the Tour of Romandie, and big races. And then finally, the Tour of Italy changed their mind. And I still have my own idea about the initial decision. I think it was not their own, or not exclusively their own decision. I think it was definitely influenced by the Tour de France. So the Tour de France had a reason not to select us. But ultimately, they saw that for their race, it was going to be a big advantage to have the opportunity to have the Tour de France winner of last year in their race, and they changed their mind a week before the Giro. And that was definitely a big challenge, because our strongest qualities were always planning the season, and here we didn't plan on it at all. But ultimately, it worked out fine, and we won that race, the Giro. And I was thinking during the Giro that the Tour de France would maybe come back on the decision. But at the same time, I had some good talks with our sponsors, and we are in a different situation like any other team. It's not a commercial entity. It's a country who is sponsoring the team. And they were very happy we were in the Giro, and that when we won the Giro, there was a big party. And that night I had a talk with the minister of Kazakhstan, and I said, let's plan on expecting a phone call, and if it's up to me, I would want to say no to Tour de France. And so I would have loved to get that call and be able to say, you know what, thank you very much for the invitation, we appreciate it, but we will come next year, if that's okay with you. But it didn't happen. And I think it's okay. We could get through the season until now very good, and I think actually what my challenge was in rebuilding the team and rebuilding the image. I think the fact that the Tour didn't select our team and the fact that they got so much negative comments about it actually helped us in improving and rebuilding our image. So at the end, in the beginning I was angry and disappointed, and I'm still disappointed, but now I really have to say thank you for the decision they made, because it made us, from 6 months ago we were hated by everybody, and now everybody likes us, so it's not that bad.
So I haven't read your book yet. Sorry.
It's no
I'm
problem.
just curious.
So you can get them on Amazon.
You helped to engineer like 8 victories, right? So I don't know if you could pull like just a couple of examples, kind of the things that you did in the background to help mastermind such victories.
Mm-hmm. That's a difficult question, because I did a lot of things. But I think that the most important thing I did, and where it all started, was probably that at the end of '98, when I retired as a rider, and all of a sudden I found myself in a situation where 3 weeks after my retirement, I retired in the month of August. I was 34 years old, and I had no idea what I was going to do for the next few years. And all of a sudden, 3 weeks after, I was the sports director of US Postal. And at that time, I didn't really know what the job was, but I accepted that job mostly because I really believed that Lance could win the Tour de France. And the fact that I could convince him and could make him believe in what I believed so strongly is probably the most important thing I've done in my career, because back in those days, Lance, he was a one-day racer, a classic specialist, and he was pretty good at it. He was the youngest world champion in history at the age of 21. And I remember that after he came back from cancer, he was very happy he was a bike rider again, and he wanted to focus again on the classics. And I know it took me a lot of effort and time to convince him that was not the good thing to do. So the fact that I could convince him of focusing on the Tour and following a really crazy plan, but only exclusively focusing on the Tour and forget about all the other races, was definitely one of the most important things I have done. And then over the years, I've grown together with Lance and with the team, because when I started, I had no experience as a director, and we played it more by the feeling we had. And if I look back now, it's 10 years later, how we did that first Tour de France, and how we managed every day to survive not only the race but also the whole circus around it. It was quite impressive. But back in those days, we didn't really realize what we were doing. We were just doing it day by day, and just doing what we felt was good. And then afterwards we became bigger and bigger, and at the end, of course, it was a little bit easier because the budgets were bigger, and we had access to a lot more facilities in terms of talent and technology and all that kind of things.
I was wondering if you can compare and contrast your experiences both as a rider and as a director, at the Tour. Like, which one was more stressful, mentally, physically? Which one was more exciting? And just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, for me, definitely my experience as a director has been more satisfying. I have won myself 2 stages in the Tour de France and worn one day the yellow jersey, which for me was a huge accomplishment, because I was not the most gifted rider out there. But for me, winning a stage was already a dream come true. I could win 2, and on top of that, I could wear the yellow jersey, and on top of that was in my own country. That special day against Miguel Indurain, who was back then the big champion. But that was, compared to what I accomplished later as a director, was totally different. And it was a lot more complex to manage a team of 9 riders in the Tour de France and win those 7 times with Lance, and then one time again with another rider. Especially because the challenge became always more and more difficult. The first one was probably the easiest one because we were really naive and we just did what we had to do. But afterwards, we became the favorites. And after 3 or 4 years of being the favorites and having the dominance of the race, I could see something create a really not so positive atmosphere amongst our competitors. And at a certain moment, the teams and certain riders were racing not to win, but to make us lose. And that was very difficult because it's one against everybody. And as of today, I still feel that's my biggest satisfaction. If you're able to win when everybody wants you to lose, that's what really feels good. It's not very pleasant while you're doing it, but when you win, it's a good party afterwards.
Okay. How do you manage egos on the team? Because everybody wants to win bike races. How do you plan out a season managing all of the egos of all of the riders on your team?
Very good question. Well, it starts with the way you hire people, of course. I've had access sometimes or the opportunity to hire big champions. And maybe physically they would fit in our structure, but I think you have to do a lot of research on their personality and how they will fit in. And I have to say that I had little problems with managing egos because Lance was so dominant that there was no question that anybody could beat him, and definitely not somebody on our team. So what I did, of course, was try to create the strongest team around him, and sometimes we hired somebody who could be a very dangerous rival. And but in most of the cases, an athlete knows very well where his limits are, and some of them they knew as long as Lance was around that they wouldn't win. So some of them preferred to be with the winner and work for him. And most of those guys, they also have learned how to do it, and afterwards they went to another team and they were pretty successful. So that's not been a big challenge. The biggest challenge definitely has been the other way around, to motivate people who were more or less in a role of always being a helper, and they also had qualities to win other races. And once you get in a certain routine of doing your job and doing what is asked from you and work for your leader, and then in other races just not be motivated, that's been my biggest challenge. And that's not always been easy.
Thank you for the book. I did read it, and it's very enjoyable. Good insight.
Thank you.
So my question is that they made a significant rule change in the Tour this year. There's no time bonuses for the intermediate sprints or the finishes, and I was wondering if you'd comment on that and what you think how you think that's going to affect the race.
I think at the end it's not going to affect the overall. It definitely affects the first week because let's say the sprinters basically have no access to getting the yellow jersey. In other years you could see that there was 20 seconds of bonification at the end of each stage. So let's say after a prologue there was some time differences, and then after 3 stages normally you would have a sprinter in the leader's jersey. And as one of the favorites and the teams of the favorites, that was very welcome because you knew that they would try to defend that jersey. And now it's not been the case. But at the same time, there's not a real team of favorites, and it's a very open race. So I don't think it really matters. Also because of the 3 or 4 favorites, there's not really somebody who can make the difference in the mountains. And before there was also 20 seconds of bonification in each mountain stage, which was sometimes very good for a specialist climber. But now it's all really complete riders who can defend themselves in the mountains, but probably not going to win a mountain stage. And I don't think it's going to affect the race a lot. It was a good try from ASO, but I don't think it's gonna matter.
Okay, thanks for coming, first of all. I don't want to minimize any of the work you did during your 7 years of winning the Tour with Lance. Certainly there's a lot to that. But I am curious, I want to focus more on last year with Alberto Contador and Levi trying to take back the gap on Rasmussen. You mentioned it in the book a lot. It was fascinating to read all the tactics that went into that. Now, Rasmussen dropped out. So obviously, through the mountains, the tactics didn't work exactly as you'd hoped. Thinking back on it, what might you have done differently if you had another chance to do it that way with those two riders?
Nothing.
Nothing?
Nothing, because I think Rasmussen was just very, very strong.
Okay.
And I mean, I think we probably made a mistake like any other team which had favorites by letting Rasmussen go that far away in that first mountain stage. But I think tactically we rode a perfect race. Okay. So I don't think we made any mistakes. We tried until the very end, and ultimately, the last mountain stage we really surrendered because he was the strongest of everybody. But afterwards he had to leave the race, so there was probably a reason for that too.
Yes, I'm not arguing that part, but clearly you didn't know that going into it. Thanks.
No, definitely not.
I hope I can ask more questions. So actually, I have two questions. One is, certainly with Lance, and I don't know what your strategy was on this score with Contador and on Leipheimer, but are you going to continue to focus on like one race, or do you now, with the team and the folks who are in the team now, going to maybe look at spreading yourself, or the team out in different areas across the year? And the other question I have is, I mean, personally, when I saw that the ASO had canceled out Astana from the team, my first thought was, the French, what a bunch of poor losers, that they want some French guy to do well in the Tour. So my question for you is there any French guy who could do well in the Tour? You don't have to answer.
The answer to the second question is right now there's not. No, I think there's a few young guys coming, but definitely, I don't see anybody really for the immediate future. What was your first question again?
About spreading yourself.
Yeah. Okay. Good. This year definitely, because we have been forced to do it, and I think we've been very successful at it. We won races in the beginning, the Giro, and now we're focusing on the Tour of Spain. And it would be a very huge accomplishment if we could win the Tour of Spain. It would first of all be a great answer to the ASO. Although, there's a little bit of a bittersweet taste now because they own half of this race now, the Tour of Spain. They bought into the Tour of Spain. But yeah, in the future, definitely. I mean, the Tour de France is the event, and there's nothing bigger than that in cycling. So I think it's really worth taking the risk and focus with our strongest part of the team on that race. But of course, there's 25 to 30 riders on every team, so there's races for everybody. And next year we're going to want to be good in the Giro also and in the classics. But I hope that next year the Tour de France is going to be our biggest goal, and that we can win it again.
Okay, this is not a very serious question, but at the end of a day of the Tour de France, you have all these riders sitting next to you at the dinner table eating a lot of food, and I've always wondered how the directors and all the non-riders can eat dinner with them and not gain a lot of weight during those 3 weeks, because everyone else is eating so much. Did you have any tactics for that, or do people actually?
Well, if you see the video of me as a rider and you see me now, my tactics were not very good. But anyway, we're not sitting at the riders' table for dinner. They usually have dinner a lot earlier, and by the time that the staff comes in, they're having dessert. So that's a good tactics. And we have a chef also who takes care of the riders. And not about us, so we just have to eat the hotel food, which is not always the best.
How often do you ride personally, and while you're here, are you going to take advantage of any of our routes? Because there's so many good ones, I'm sure Dylan can show you. And lastly, Luke Armstrong, do you spend much time with him and the girls, and Grace and Isabel? And do you see any kind of Lance in them as far as bike riding?
Okay. Well, the first part of your question is I don't ride my bike at all. It's difficult to understand for somebody who hasn't been a professional rider, but and I just had that discussion with Dylan a little bit also, because I know he's still riding a lot. But when I finished, I was 34 years old, and I had probably been for 19 years or more than 20 years on a bike. And I calculated probably 15 times around the world by bike, which is quite a lot. And when you finish your career, when you're 33, 34, I think that every professional sports is leaving some damage to the body. And you get injured, and you get bad tendons, and because you're pushing yourself all the time over the limit. And it was actually one of the reasons why I stopped, because I was injured all the time. And I have to say that nowadays, if I push myself too much, I'm getting injured all the time also. So, but I think the main reason why I'm not riding my bike is because I associate it so much with suffering. And there's other ways to exercise for me, and I have a gym at my house, and I have 2 very, very nice spinning bikes, and I catch myself all the time that I would do whatever to not get on those bikes. I run, or I'm on with the weights or whatever, but I'm not getting on the bike. So it's something here that is still not really. I didn't forget about the suffering yet. And then the second thing was about Lance's kids, yeah. Well, unfortunately, I don't spend a lot of time with them, but Lance sent me pictures all the time about how they're growing. And what I know is that Luke he's a competitor, and he's pretty good at soccer, and he's taking tennis classes. I don't know if he's going to be a bike rider, but he definitely has the character of his dad, and. So I don't know if he's going to make it into professional sports or not, but I think the genes are there. And one of the girls also is very similar to him, so maybe there's something there also. Dylan, that's going to be a difficult one. Do you want me to tell that story?
You can tell it. So a couple things, and correct me, if there was a French rider that could win the Tour, you'd hire them. And
as of today, probably not.
Well, but you might have, because in the past we took on French riders.
Yes, we did,
and that was probably for a good reason.
It was more because in the beginning, when and you know this, when Postal in '99 and 2000, we were a small team.
Yeah.
We were a 2nd division team, and I remember they called us the Bad News Bears of cycling. And actually, we had to earn our invitation for the tour. We were not qualified automatically. So having a French rider on board was definitely an advantage.
Right.
But I've never seen, a rider on our team who was French and who could win the tour. It was more a PR move.
Sure. I thought it would be fun maybe to get you to share some stories of what goes on in the car back in the caravan. As a rider, I try to spend the least amount of time back there, but I know that a lot goes on back there, and there's some discussions that go on between the directors, and I remember a few times at home watching the tour and wondering, why is Rabobank on the front pulling right now? Because I'm looking down, they have no general classification objectives, there's no sprint finish.
Which year was that?
I think there were a couple, but you can choose which one to talk about.
No, there's a lot of things going on. First of all, it's you have to imagine it's very hectic in the car, and there's so many different things going on. There's a radio which gives information on the race situation, and then you have radio contact with your riders all the time. You have a TV. Journalists are calling you for interviews, and then sometimes they stick a microphone into your window to do an interview on TV also while you're driving. But no, it's true that sometimes there's certain discussions going on between teams. But most of the time it's because there's a common interest, and it was one of my biggest challenges to find some help on the road, and I didn't find a lot of help because as I said, most of the years the teams were riding to make us lose rather than to help us to defend their own interest. But you have to know that at the Tour de France, it's such a big race, and there's other interests. There's the green jersey in the game. Sometimes there's the team classification in the game, and I think we've always been smart to not focus on those things. There was a number of years where we probably could have won the team classification. But we on purpose we didn't do that, because we basically left it to another team, because we knew that in the last week this was going to be a big help for us when the situation was created where their leader's position was in danger. So, but that Rabobank thing, that's another story, and it was an open account actually. It was a service we did in the classics, and then the promise was that they would help us at least one day in the Tour de France, and they did. It was very difficult for them to justify that action, so I left it to the PR guy of Rabobank, who had a difficult time explaining to the press what they did that day.
Continuing on the car thing, I always wonder why you directors drive when you have to think about so many other things. It must be crazy. But my first question was, how much information do you encourage from the riders that are on the road? Because you can't see everywhere, and you want to know about other teams that are struggling or look like they're strategizing. I want to know about that. Second question, what kind of technology would you love to have in both directions that you don't have right now?
Well, the information coming back from the riders to the car is very important, very valuable, and I think that's what gave us an advantage, at least in the first few years, because we had radios on every single rider, and back then, the teams, they had one of their riders or the team captain or maybe two of them, and I've always encouraged the riders to tell me what was going on, because you can have a theory before the race and say this, and we're going to do this and this and this, but basically the riders are the guys who feel what's going on, and they see, first of all, they know how they feel and if they're able to execute a plan or not, and then secondly they see how the others are, and we cannot see that from the car. So it was one of our biggest weapons, that the information coming back from the riders to the car, and from every single one. And I encouraged everybody to talk on the radio, and Lance was very very good at that, but over the years, and we had some experienced guys like George and Chechu Rubiera, who were basically my information sources on the road. What was the second question again?
Technologies. What kind of technologies is used now, and what would you rather have?
Yeah, well, we've always been very, very interested in using whatever we could use, and which was also allowed. And a few times we have tried something, and then they saw we were using it, and they banned it. But nowadays I don't think technology can really get a lot further. You could say in the race you have to be able to follow the heart rate of the riders, but I don't think that really brings anything, because if they're on the limit, they're on the limit, and you can tell them they have to follow the bunch, they have to follow whatever everybody else does. So I think it's really as good as it can get now. The challenge has been basically the quality of the communication with the riders, and that's still a challenge as of today, because it's very fragile material, and sometimes the quality is not so good. Mainly the sound that comes back from the rider to the car, and we've worked on that the last few years with Discovery, and we had a pretty good system, which as of today is still probably one of the best systems around. But it's a car, and you have to drive. And to answer the question about why directors are driving, it's something I've tried a few times, and I couldn't stand it, because when you're driving, it makes you able to really act while you're thinking. And when you're sitting there and you have to say to this guy, do this or do this, sometimes you lose valuable seconds, and it all happens so fast that it's better to drive yourself.
Is it as dangerous as it looks?
It's not. It looks very hectic, but just have in mind that the speeds are pretty low. It's 60 kilometers an hour maximum. So even if you have a crash with another car, normally it's not a big deal. But I have to say that 1 year I had. Does everybody know who Fernando Alonso is? The world champion Formula One the last few years. I had him as a guest a few years ago as a passenger, and it's a very funny story, because he's a huge bike fan, and he was a fan of the team because he's very good friends with Rubiera. They're from the same area, and he came to train a few times with the team and stuff like that. He's pretty good on the bike, actually. But so he was sitting next to me, and after an hour, he says, "Hey, what's going on here? This is just crazy." And he called one of his friends, and he said, after 100 kilometers, there's a feed zone. They're going to stop. Come to pick me up because I cannot stand this. And this is a guy who's driving 300 kilometers per hour himself. But the fact that they are sitting next to somebody and they are not in control was something that he couldn't handle.
So you,
We have 2 more questions. Is that okay? 1 and 2.
okay. You mentioned you stopped riding a bike after you retired from riding. Are you going to stop driving a car when you retire from being a director?
Yeah, I am retired. I am retired as a director, so I'm not. Last year, I decided that it was it for me, and I'm not at the races anymore, or not so often. Sometimes I go because I miss it, but I'm actually not directing the races anymore now. So, yeah, I'm done with that.
But do you drive a car yourself?
Sorry?
Do you still drive a car?
Private, I do, yeah, but I have a family. I have a young daughter of 4.5 years old, so I have a pretty powerful car, but I drive like a granddad.
So hopefully this is a good question for closing for everyone. You mentioned the Tour of California and your success there this year, and I think the Tour of California is growing and becoming a much more amazing event, and obviously everything Lance has done for the sport in America. Overall, where do you see cycling in America going? What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? How do we help grow the sport?
I think it's going good. There's 3 good events: Tour of California, the Tour of Georgia, and the Tour of Missouri, which is now coming a little bit more popular after last year's event. And I think the good thing is that there's 2 American teams in the Tour de France right now. So I don't think that people have to be too worried or too impatient. There's a few young riders who have big talent, and just to name one, the son of what's his name, Taylor Phinney. In my opinion, he's a very big talent. And so I think that every generation needs kind of one person who sets the tone. We've seen it with Lance. Lance was one of those guys, and the generation around him really grew with him. And so I hope that can happen again. No, I'm pretty optimistic for cycling in America. The events are great. It's a good organization. It's very professional. Now the Tour de France is also a little bit involved in the Tour of California, so I think that's going to grow the event also. So no, I'm pretty optimistic for American cycling. I'm going to finish with one little story. Is Dylan still here? Oh, there he is. Yeah. I was actually talking with him about that before, and it's when he was on the team what year was it? 2001, 2? Oh, was it 99? Oh, that's a long time ago. But anyway, Dylan was a great time trial specialist, and he was selected for the Tour of Spain in his first year with the team. And the big stage races always start with a prologue, and it was one of his big motivations, a big goal for him. And he was in good shape. He had finished 3rd in the Tour of Holland 2-3 weeks before, and he had actually been 2nd in the time trial, I guess. So Dylan was selected for the Tour of Spain, and I thought, he can be very good in the prologue in this first stage, and if you can win that event, you have the yellow jersey. And I had normally the directors, we have to give a list of the participants and also the order in which they're going to start every team. And I had put Dylan in the first 3 riders, which means that he starts off early. And a few days before the race, Dylan called me and he said, would it be okay with you if I start in the last guy, so I have the time splits of all these favorites and I can focus on these time references? And I said, well, it's difficult to change, but if you really insist, I'm going to do it. And so we get to the race, and the race starts, and it was in the south of Spain where it's always beautiful weather. And the first 30 riders started, and it was beautiful weather, and all of a sudden it started to rain. And if Dylan would have not given that call, he would probably have been one of the only Americans having wear the yellow jersey in the Tour of Spain. So It's something funny to remember, but he did his best and he finished very close, but he didn't get it. Sorry. Thank you for your interest and for the interesting questions.